The Terracotta Army ranks among the most extraordinary archaeological finds in all of human history. Every single year, millions of visitors crowd the edges of those underground pits, gazing down at endless rows of clay warriors and assuming they grasp what they are truly seeing. They are wrong. Albert Lin has just peeled back a layer beneath it, all that is frankly deeply unsettling. And the further his scanning equipment penetrated the earth, the more obvious it became that the emperor did not simply construct a tomb. He raised his final kingdom on top of something truly monstrous. What lies down there does not belong anywhere near a burial ground. Hidden chambers, strange anomalies in the soil, a history of betrayal that was locked away underground while people were still alive and breathing. What follows is the truth that the clay soldiers were never intended to allow to escape. The army is not positioned there to guard the emperor. It stands there to ensure the truth never sees the light of day. Most visitors to this site become fixated entirely on the warriors. 8,000 individual clay figures, every one of them unique, everyone bearing a distinct face, spread out across enormous underground pits that extend far further than most people ever appreciate. But the warriors are nothing more than the front door. The full scope of this underground complex spreads across thousands of acres. Researchers who have studied the wider layout have come to believe the emperor was not simply making arrangements for death. He was engineering a complete, functioning replica of his entire empire. If the world above collapsed, if his dynasty fell to ruin and his enemies prevailed, his spirit would still find a whole civilization waiting beneath the ground, perfect, permanent, and totally under his command. This explains why the complex contains clay stables, bronze tools that remained operational after 2,000 years, and sculpted animals crafted from the same fired earth as the soldiers themselves. There are clay birds, clay farming instruments, every last element of ordinary daily life recreated underground, so the emperor would never lack for anything. Yet there is a theory that reaches far beyond simple preparation. Certain researchers believe the emperor was not merely planning for the afterlife. He was actively trying to conquer death itself. For decades, he pursued an immortality potion with total obsession, dispatching expeditions to the farthest reaches of the known world, consulting mystics and alchemists, and consuming substances his advisors swore would extend his life without limit. This was no idle rumor, it is all documented. He genuinely regarded death as a solvable problem, and he commanded the full resources of an empire to find that solution. When every search returned empty-handed, he redirected his focus toward the tomb itself. Some scholars now argue the entire complex was never a place of rest at all, but rather a machine, a vast ritualistic engine engineered to drag his soul back across the boundary separating death from life. Each clay soldier, every channel of flowing liquid mercury, every star painted onto the ceiling of the inner chamber was a functioning piece of that machine, a pathway for his spirit to follow back home. It sounds like pure superstition until you confront the precision involved. The soldiers are not oriented in some arbitrary direction. They face east, toward the territories of the enemies the emperor spent his lifetime subduing. He was not at rest. Even in death, he was aligned and ready for the next campaign. Nothing was accidental. The real shock came when high-resolution cameras looked beyond those clay faces and into the darkness stretching out behind them. Albert Lin did not approach this site the way an ordinary visitor would. Long before he ever stepped off the plane, he already understood the full gravity of what he was walking into. Lin is not the sort of researcher who tackles a mystery armed with nothing but a shovel and a notebook. He operates with instruments purpose-built to locate things that were deliberately hidden. Scanning technology originally designed for tracking buried objects in active war zones. Equipment capable of reading the earth the way medical x-rays read a human body. His contributions are recognized at the very highest levels of the field internationally. He has worked within some of the most tightly controlled and sensitive archaeological environments anywhere on the planet. Even so, none of that experience fully braced him for what the Chinese government had been quietly sitting on here for decades. Getting into the restricted sections of this site was nearly out of the question. For decades upon decades, the most sensitive zones were held under tight government authority. Drone flights above the entire complex were banned outright. Every single scan demanded authorization from the very top levels of oversight. Even Chinese researchers who had spent decades working the site often operated without a full understanding of what existed beneath them. The information was divided up on purpose. Separate teams held separate pieces. Nobody outside an extremely small circle had the full picture. Somehow, Lin managed to secure permission to go where no foreign investigator had ever been permitted before. How exactly that permission was obtained has never been properly explained. From the moment his team stepped onto the grounds, the tension was immediate and almost physical in nature. Uniformed officers tracked his every move. They went through his equipment item by item before allowing any of it inside. Every drone flight required its own separate formal request. Every scan was carried out with someone standing right behind him, eyes fixed on the screen as the data came in. As his team set up their instruments inside the pits, the air felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with depth or temperature. Lin said afterward that standing at the heart of the complex felt like occupying a space that had never been intended for the living. That observation is not meant as a figure of speech. Very few people had ever stood in those particular spots. Even fewer had been allowed to point instruments at what lay below. He passed through chambers that had been sealed for more than 2,000 years. Clay soldiers rose up in every direction around him. Some were posed as though a fraction of a second away from drawing a weapon, while others held a stillness that felt more disturbing than outright aggression. He saw carriages whose wheels remained structurally intact, stables filled with clay horses frozen mid-stride, as if waiting on a rider who was never going to arrive, bronze swords and spear tips sharp enough to draw blood even today, tools left sitting mid-task, as though the person using them had simply stepped away and never returned. Every pit was a moment suspended in time, a room where time had just stopped and stayed that way. But Lin had not come there to admire the artistry. He was there to uncover what the human eye could not reach, what the instruments would reveal. His drones lifted into the air carrying the most sophisticated scanning equipment available. On the ground, his team guided radar systems in methodical sweeps across the floor, reading the earth dozens of feet beneath their boots. As he observed the rows of silent figures from overhead, an unease settled across the entire team and deepened with every hour that passed. The sheer beauty of the sculptures seemed to be serving a purpose, pulling the eye upward and outward, directing attention to the surface and away from whatever might be resting underneath. That was not paranoia speaking. That was pattern recognition at work. Something was there to be found, something the emperor had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure nobody would ever find. The communities living around this site have always known it as a place that carries a curse. That reputation stretches back centuries before the 1974 discovery. The farmers who broke through into the first pit said the experience permanently changed their lives. Some had their land taken through government acquisition, others lost their health under circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained. The story that has passed from person to person ever since is that they opened something that was never meant to be opened. And that opening left its mark on everyone who came into contact with it. Lin had to set all of that aside. He is a scientist. But even a scientist carries something inside when he walks into a place where thousands of people came to a violent end beneath layers of clay and silence. The technology Lin relied on is known as ground-penetrating radar. It functions by sending precise pulses of energy down into the earth. When those pulses hit something solid, a wall, a floor, a buried object, a dense mass of compressed material, they bounce back up to the surface and construct a picture of what is concealed below, a map built entirely out of shadows and echoes. When those maps appeared on his screens, the team fell silent. Walls that showed up on no existing architectural record. Vertical shafts plunging over 100 feet straight down into the earth, and clusters of shapes, thousands of small, tightly packed objects that nobody could identify right away. One explanation is that these clusters represent the emperor's personal belongings, ordinary items from his daily life, reproduced in lasting materials so they would never decay. The kind of things a man consumed by the idea of eternity would want kept nearby. Another explanation is considerably darker. Certain researchers believe the scanners were not picking up objects at all. They were picking up the remains of the emperor's actual court. Not ceramic figures standing in for living people, but real human beings placed there themselves to serve in death just as they had served in life. The further the equipment probed into the ground, the less the underground landscape resembled a complex, and the more it resembled an enormous, chaotic burial ground, layer upon layer of disturbed earth, deep shadows with no architectural reason behind them. The picture forming on those screens was nothing anyone had been ready to see. The graves beneath the army. For a considerable time, no aircraft had ever been allowed to fly over this site. The airspace above it was effectively restricted. Albert Lin changed all of that. He became the first individual to fly scanning equipment over the emperor's burial complex and observe it from above. At that altitude, the true scale of the underground world came into focus in a way that decades of ground-level research had never managed to reveal. He used a technology called LiDAR, a laser-based imaging system capable of cutting through vegetation, surface soil, and obscuring material to map buried structures with remarkable precision. What it revealed beneath the pits, the world already knew about, was a dense, sprawling network of hidden structures, buried walls stretching well beyond known boundaries, collapsed chambers absent from any existing map, and areas where large numbers of people appeared to have been placed into the earth all at once. Several of these locations showed thermal signatures consistent with ancient fires, evidence of intense heat events absorbed deep into the ground, preserved there across 2,000 years. Then the team reached the section that brought everything to a halt. Deep beneath the feet of the clay soldiers, the scans uncovered clusters of irregular, disturbed holes in the earth, too chaotic to represent intentional architecture, yet too orderly to be the result of natural geological processes. The pattern was one forensic archaeologists recognized immediately: mass graves. The soil in those zones was damaged in a particular way, compressed and fractured in patterns consistent with enormous force applied all at once. Not the slow, even weight of time and settling earth, but the concentrated, violent force of something catastrophic. Fracture lines running through the stratigraphy, scattered dense shapes corresponding to human remains. Lin stared at the readout and stayed silent for a long moment. He had encountered difficult data before. This was something else entirely. What lies beneath the clay army is not simply a palace constructed for a dead ruler. It is a burial ground, and it is not a burial ground for people who were shown any honor. The historical record tells us that 700,000 people were conscripted to build this complex. 700,000. The construction stretched across decades. People came from all across China and never made it back home. For a long time, historians assumed they were let go once the work was finished, returning to their villages and farmland. The scan data points toward a very different conclusion. If even a small portion of those workers were sealed inside when construction came to an end, the Terracotta Army stands above one of the largest mass burial sites in the entire history of human civilization. The theory that has circulated for centuries is that the emperor used the construction project as a deliberate instrument of elimination. People he viewed as threats, political rivals, dissidents, anyone who had witnessed too much or learned too much were assigned to the work sites under the cover of national service. And then, once their usefulness was gone, steps were taken to make certain they never walked away. The radar findings made this theory nearly impossible to set aside. The patterns of disturbed soil were consistent with violent physical movement, what forensic geologists refer to as struggle layers, ground that has been churned and compressed by bodies in motion. The tunnels appeared to have been closed off from the outside, while people remained trapped within them. And in the deeper levels, the scans returned signatures matching the profile of metal components, possible remnants of mechanical crossbow traps described in ancient texts, devices engineered to discharge on anyone who entered the sealed passages without clearance. Most researchers had long assumed the wooden trigger mechanisms would have decayed over 2,000 years. The bronze components, however, are an entirely different matter. The radar also uncovered something no prior research had ever detected: a pyramid-shaped structure of densely compacted earth buried directly beneath the main mound, concealed so thoroughly that it remains completely invisible from the surface, a secret hidden within another secret. Whatever the emperor deemed most essential was placed beneath everything else, shielded by layer after layer of stone, earth, clay soldiers, and the bodies of the very people who constructed them. The perfectly ordered rows of warriors standing above were not arranged for aesthetics or ritual. They were arranged as a seal. What they were concealing was not glory. It was the true price of constructing an empire built to endure forever. The prince who perished in the darkness. Near the center of the scan, the research team identified an anomaly that did not match the surrounding layout. Beneath the organized arrangement of known chambers sat a single isolated void, older than the structures surrounding it, dug considerably deeper, as though whoever placed it there intended it to lie beneath everything else, invisible, unreachable, and deliberately forgotten. Inside that void was one skeleton. This individual had not been discarded the way the others had been. The bones were positioned with intentional care. They belonged to a young man, most likely in his early 20s. The objects discovered near the remains were not the belongings of a laborer or captive. They were costly, high-status items, the kind of possessions carried by someone born into considerable power. But what silenced everyone present was what the imaging revealed inside the skull: a bronze arrowhead, driven deep into the bone. This was no accident. This was not stray debris from some battle fought elsewhere. This was an execution, precise, deliberate, and carried out on someone who had been buried separately with great care in a location specifically engineered to ensure no one would ever find him. The question of how he died was resolved in moments. The question of who he was took considerably longer, and the answer that surfaced was deeply unsettling. Historical records from that era document the sons of the first emperor. Princes born into extraordinary privilege, raised inside a court where power and paranoia coexisted in equal measure, and where extending trust to anyone was never truly safe. Several of those princes vanished from the historical record without any explanation. Their names appeared in documents and then simply ceased to. No account of their deaths, no mention of exile or disgrace, just a silence where a life had once been, as though the record itself had received instructions to erase them. As researchers studied the details surrounding this burial, its position relative to the central mound, the quality of the grave goods, the depth, the extraordinary effort taken to hide it from above, a picture took shape that nobody in that room was willing to accept. This was not a laborer. This was not a common prisoner. This young man may well have been one of the emperor's own children. He was not killed by an enemy approaching from outside. He was killed on an order that originated from within his own bloodline. The chamber itself deepened the horror. It was not shaped like a tomb. Its dimensions matched those of a confinement cell. The placement of the skeleton hinted that this young man may have been kept alive in that underground space for weeks or even months before the end finally arrived. Kept breathing, kept silent, wiped from the world above while he was still very much alive in the world below. The stress markers visible throughout the bone structure were consistent with prolonged captivity under harsh conditions. There is a theory about who issued the order. The emperor's successor was his second son, a man who seized control in the immediate wake of his father's death. Historians have long believed that his consolidation of power involved the deliberate removal of every sibling who might credibly contest his right to rule. Not one or two rivals, all of them. The scans revealed multiple additional voids matching the dimensions of this prince's chamber, distributed at regular intervals around the central mound. The same shape, the same depth, the same intentional placement beneath the level of everything else. An entire royal generation wiped out and buried alongside the laborers and prisoners who had constructed their father's tomb. In the eyes of the man who claimed the throne, they were all equally threatening. They were all secrets. And secrets in the world the first emperor built belonged underground. The scrolls that survived inside sealed chambers near the emperor's main burial site offered researchers something they had not anticipated finding after 2,000 years: bamboo scrolls. To preserve them, the team was required to work inside a controlled environment where both temperature and humidity were maintained within tolerances measured in fractions. The scrolls were extraordinarily delicate. Exposure to the wrong conditions for even a few minutes could have permanently destroyed them. The process of carefully opening them took weeks rather than days. What the text actually contained once they were finally read aloud was not a catalogue of accomplishments. It was not a monument built to the emperor's legacy. To the historians who read through them, it felt far more like a record of crimes. Line by line, the scrolls described a society governed by fear rather than by law. One document recorded an imperial decree ordering 460 scholars and intellectuals to be buried alive, not executed swiftly. Buried. Their offense was preserving philosophical and historical ideas the emperor had never sanctioned. Ideas that implied other ways of organizing society were possible, that his power was not the only kind of power that could exist. Other scrolls documented the systematic burning of books across China. Not only political texts, history, philosophy, science, medical knowledge. The deliberate destruction of any recorded thought that might give someone a framework for questioning the emperor's absolute authority. Some of the most disturbing documents were confessions signed by engineers, builders, and craftsmen who had labored on the tomb complex. Reading the charges laid against them is a deeply unsettling experience. Some were accused of harboring critical thoughts regarding the emperor's methods, others of working too slowly, others of associations with individuals who had themselves been accused of something. The chain of accusation spreading outward in every direction with no logical boundary. The confessions were extracted, recorded, filed away, and then the people who had signed them joined the thousands already beneath the clay. Everyone on that construction site was being watched. Every action was being evaluated. Every relationship represented a potential liability. One careless word, one moment of visible hesitation, one accusation from a colleague with something to gain, and you became part of the foundation rather than someone who had built it. As historians read those texts aloud inside the complex, Lin stood quietly and watched the clay soldiers. He said afterward that in that particular moment, the figures transformed before his eyes. They stopped being extraordinary works of art. They stopped being symbols of military strength or imperial ambition or the remarkable skill of ancient craftsmen. They had become exactly what they always truly were: a permanent garrison standing in formation above a place constructed on suffering and enforced silence, keeping watch to ensure that suffering remained buried. The scrolls also recorded the emperor's obsession with immortality in a level of detail that secondary historical accounts had only partially managed to capture. He dispatched entire fleets carrying thousands of young men and women to go searching for a legendary island at the far edge of the world where a potion said to conquer death was supposedly kept by immortals. Those ships never came back. The most disturbing interpretation of their disappearance is that they were not simply lost at sea. Certain historians believe the emperor deliberately arranged for them to never return. Because coming back empty-handed would mean standing before the imperial court and publicly confirming that the emperor was just a mortal man who would age and weaken and eventually die like every other human being who had ever lived. The ships that vanished may have been silenced for precisely the same reason everything else within this story was silenced. Some sections of the scrolls still resist complete translation even today. Certain passages appear to describe a method for bringing the clay figures to life, animating the entire army through breath and intention. Whether this was meant as literal instruction or as symbolic language embedded in ritual context remains actively debated among scholars. What it confirms beyond any real doubt is that the emperor's belief in the actual mechanics of the supernatural was genuine. He was not performing ceremony merely for the benefit of his subjects. He truly believed that at the right moment, the clay army would rise to its feet. The scrolls also describe something buried beneath the main chamber that no modern excavation has ever managed to locate. A room filled with gold and jewels on a scale that the ancient texts themselves seem to struggle to put into words. Scanning technology has detected a massive hollow space, roughly 3 full stories in height, positioned directly below the central palace floor. It appears to be real, it appears to match the description, but the scrolls carry a warning alongside it. The treasure is bathed in the poison of the stars. That phrase almost certainly refers to Mercury, and Mercury is where this story arrives at its final and most dangerous chapter, the poison that guards everything. At the very heart of the entire complex sits a location that no one has ever opened. No archaeologist, no government official, no researcher working at any level of authorization, nobody. The main tomb of the first emperor of China has remained sealed for over 2,000 years, and it stays sealed to this day. Not because people have lacked the desire to open it, but because they are genuinely afraid of what might happen if they do. Soil samples collected from the ground around the central burial mound do not show mercury levels that are mildly elevated. They show concentrations hundreds of times greater than anything that occurs naturally. Ancient written accounts describe the emperor's architects engineering rivers of liquid mercury to flow continuously through a miniature model of his palace inside the burial chamber, a tiny empire in silver, running endlessly beneath the earth, the palace above in permanent miniature below. For a very long time, those accounts were treated as legend, as exaggeration, the kind of story that grows larger with each generation of retelling. The soil readings confirm that the heart of the story is not exaggeration at all. It is documentation. If the main chamber were open today, the pressurized atmosphere that has been building inside it for 2,000 years would vent outward in an instant. Mercury vapor at the concentration suggested by the soil data is acutely toxic. Lethal exposure can occur within minutes at concentrations far lower than what the data here indicates. What would begin as the most significant archaeological excavation in modern history could turn into a mass casualty event before anyone had any time to respond. And that is not the only threat. In the 1980s, researchers opened a smaller subsidiary pit for the very first time. For anyone who witnessed it firsthand, the sight was devastating. The paint coating those clay soldiers, colors kept in flawless condition for more than 2,000 years, began flaking off within mere seconds of being exposed to open air. The shift in pressure and humidity triggered a chemical reaction that could not be undone. Shades that had endured for 2 millennia vanished before anyone had a chance to intervene. If the emperor's main burial chamber holds wooden frameworks, silk fabrics, or painted walls, unsealing the tomb could wipe out the very history it was meant to preserve. The act of discovery and the act of destruction would occur simultaneously. Lin's scans of the central structure only made the mystery feel heavier. The data lined up with ancient records describing what rests inside the sealed chamber. Yet one conclusion stood out with unmistakable clarity. The emperor built this place with the intention that it would stay sealed forever. The mercury rivers, mechanical traps, enormous depth, and multiple burial layers were all deliberately engineered to prevent future generations from setting foot inside. He anticipated that someone would eventually make the attempt. So far, humanity has honored that design, not out of reverence for the emperor himself, but because researchers grasp what could be lost, The moment a chamber never meant to be disturbed is cracked open. The Terracotta Army is not simply a display of power or devotion. It functions as a seal. Beneath those thousands of clay figures lie the workers who perished right where they labored. Political rivals scrubbed from the historical record. Scholars put to death for their beliefs, and princes eliminated to protect the emperor's grip on his throne. 8,000 warriors remain standing in perfect formation, facing eastward, standing guard over secrets that were never supposed to have any witnesses. Albert Lin walked onto that site as a man of science and departed carrying evidence that confirmed what ancient texts had long implied. One of the most extraordinary archaeological wonders on the planet may simultaneously be one of the largest crime scenes in all of human history. The real question isn't whether something even more unsettling than mercury pools and ancient traps is waiting inside that final chamber. The real question is whether we are truly ready to face whatever truth lies buried there. Leave your thoughts down in the comments. If this story shifted the way you think about history, hit like and subscribe, because some of humanity's most guarded secrets may still be resting quietly underground. Thanks for watching.